Okay, so tonight, without further ado, I'm not going to introduce the speakers too much because you all registered for it, and so therefore you've read the fantastic little bios about our speakers. But Paul Wylde and Nathan Shedroff will be sharing design and collector stories about the Concorde, its dishes, and the dining experience of dining at twice the speed of sound. And I think, and I know for sure that they're both going to introduce themselves. And we're really happy to have Paul Wylde and Nathan Shedroff this evening talking about dining on the Concorde. So take it away, gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Margaret. Nathan, I'll go first if I may. Thanks to Bill and thanks to the whole team at the Dinnerware Museum for organising today, this evening. My name is Paul Wylde. I am a lifelong seeker of beauty and designer of small spaces and uh, expresser of brand. I guess that's what it still excites me. I've been doing this type of work now for, oh my goodness, 40 odd years, trained as an industrial designer, really incubated my career in brand strategy. And now I'm very fortunate to be running my own consultancy. It's a small consultancy, and we have a specialism in designing for aviation. There's the seeds of which were sown during my 6 years at British Airways as design manager. And it's an absolute pleasure to share with you today my little bit of knowledge on Concorde. I met Nathan, oh my goodness, Nathan, it must be 10 years ago when we were at Teague up in Seattle. So Nathan and I crossed paths. And for anybody who doesn't know Teague, it is the agency that was founded by Walter Darwin Teague, one of the great pioneering American industrial designers. In fact, I believe it was Teague who first dubbed the term industrial design. And Teague has the Boeing account. And to my knowledge, it's the longest client agency relationship from a design perspective anyway in North America. Over to Nathan, perhaps for his intro now.
Yeah, I thank you, Paul, and thank you all for coming and having this conversation. I'm a designer as well. I have a car design degree that I never went into the industry. Instead, I grew up in information design and interaction design. And I've been teaching for 25 years at the same institution here in San Francisco, California College of the Arts. I currently teach in a graduate interaction design program, but I still have, cars and planes and spacecraft in my blood. So
Very good. Thank you, Nathan. So without further ado, doors to manual and cross-check, please. Yeah, this is a recent project. So often we get involved with helping brands position themselves. So with JSX here, that involved naming, brand identity, cabin interior design. And we also consult with a relatively new discipline. So that's in the last 10 to 12 years, service design. Where service is recognized as an integral component or channel of the customer experience. And the wonderful thing about designing for airlines is it has all the elements of design involved with it. It is the positioning, it's the brand identity, it's the experience design, it's the service design. It truly is the micro and the macro. And the key to successful airline design is that first impression when you walk in a cabin. Within 2 or 3 seconds, your airline has got precious little time to send you the signal that you are in a Delta Airlines space, or you are in a United Airlines space, or you are in a British Airways space. And then the rest of your time is focused on the micro, it's the detail, because there isn't much to do when you fly. It's a forced time and it's a very unnatural experience. So the key to airline design is balancing the macro and the micro, which is why things like crockery and glassware and cutlery, they're so important, because when you interact with these pieces, it's an opportunity for the airline to transmit the right message to you. You know, this is an airline that you can trust. This is an airline that is quality. This is an airline that's worth paying a price for. This is an airline that's well maintained and safe. All of these connotations are confirmed or reconfirmed through how you interact with the product. So the catering is a very important element indeed. And of course, part of the catering product is the crockery and the cutlery and the glassware. The first time I saw Concorde, you know, I can remember it. I truly can. I'm not making this up for impact today. I was under 10 years of age because I was in my primary school playground, playing hide and seek with all the other kids. This was in East London, circa 1978. And the roar of the Concorde that just completely engulfs everything. It sounds more like a rocket than a plane. That's because of those four very specific Rolls-Royce Olympic engines that deliver incredible amounts of thrust. This aircraft was unique. It flew at twice the speed of sound. That's faster than a speeding bullet. It was the only aircraft in the British Airways fleet that was white. Every other aircraft had a blue underbelly. That's because we couldn't find a blue paint that could resist the extreme heat caused by the friction of traveling at twice the speed of sound. And the whole playground would stop and look in awe at this magnificent aircraft that majestically graced our presence. And it summed up everything that was good about British ingenuity, British innovation, British engineering. Of course, Concorde was developed in collaboration with the French governments. It was Tony Benn, I believe, the Labour Minister for Transport, who partnered with the French in creating a supersonic solution for the future of travel. So Concorde was conceived in the late 60s, designed and developed in the 70s, and went into service and started to have a big commercial impact in the early 80s. British Airways bought 6 Concordes from the British government for £1. I had that incredible fact confirmed today by a dear friend of mine who was once an engineer on Concorde. And for 3 years, his task was to check for cracks inside the fuel compartment. Tony Cootie, he's still at British Airways. He's an engineer there now. Concorde was unique. It was the flagship of the British Airways fleet. Along with the French, it was the only supersonic commercial aircraft of its kind. Thus, it had unique qualities and unique opportunities to market. It wasn't positioned as a luxury product. That's very important. First class was positioned as luxury. Business class was positioned as allowing you to arrive relaxed and refreshed as you travel predominantly on business. But Concorde was positioned as the ultimate business tool in that you can get to New York faster than a speeding bullet, and you can arrive at JFK before you've taken off in London. The average flight span was something like 3.5 to 4 hours, depending on the weather. So those 2 hours that you captured were crucial, especially if you're a merchant banker and you have to sign a deal, you have to be there in person. In fact, that's what many customers did. They would fly supersonic to JFK, but they would fly subsonic on the return flight because they were buying time. So subsequently, we never positioned Concorde as luxury. It was more around a business tool or a sports car, which we'll come on to that later. When Concorde, so the opportunity came up in 1997 to redesign the last ever Concorde interior. The thinking at the time was we could probably justify one more refresh of the interior before the aircraft is finally decommissioned. It was the oldest plane in the fleet. It was incredibly difficult to maintain because anybody who worked on the original Concorde had long passed. Spare parts had to be manufactured specifically. There was no back catalogue of spare parts. So increasingly, there were pressure by the business to reduce cost, inevitably, and Concorde was always a target for a potential decommissioning, which in fact it was, I believe, in 1994. But don't fact check me on that in case I got it wrong. But Concorde reflected or conveyed or portrayed this incredible time of growth, of optimism, of liberty, of freedom, the opening of markets, anything's possible. Largely driven, if I may say so, by Thatcher and Reagan. I included Phil Collins here because there was a famous experience during Live Aid. So I don't know if you remember the concert that was organized by Bob Geldof to raise funds for the famines that were happening in Ethiopia at the time. He opened the concert in London, flew on Concorde, and then closed it in New York. So only Concorde could allow him to do that. Subsequently, the design of the Concorde interior grew out of the 80s spirit of power design, masculinity, functionality. This was the previous interior that we inherited. And the brief from our colleagues in marketing was, well, customers are no longer satisfied and they are paying a lot of money for these tickets. If memory serves me correct, the average price of a Concorde ticket return was around £13,000. Now, that doesn't seem like a lot in today's money, but believe me, 25 years ago, that was a major expense, especially when customer feedback was, this interior is tired and dated. It's very functional. It doesn't reflect the magic that the functionality of this aircraft conveys. It's hot and uncomfortable, and it feels very, very cramped. Now, obviously, we can't actually do anything to make the aircraft larger, but we can at least try and make customers feel more comfortable. And perhaps we can use some tricks of design to give the illusion of space, even if we can't deliver actual space. And also, culture had moved on. Color was in vogue. Products started to have personalities. They started to feel more humane. There was a new approach to globalization, a softer approach. It was less about the striving and the growth and the fighting of the 80s, and it was a more compassionate, more gentle lifestyle, and products reflected that. I chose Apple as an obvious example. The curvature, the organic forms, the use of joy and color, that was reflected also in automotive design as well, through things like the Beetle. And also, I think it's important just to acknowledge it was a time of incredible confidence back in the UK. We were proud to be British again. And just for a short period of time, we were probably the coolest country in the world. We were leading the pop charts. Our art was provocative and leading and cutting edge. And it was a great time to be around. I miss the 90s. And at the same time, incredible, seminal, industry-changing innovation was happening in different parts of the British Airways experience. We were the first carrier at the time to have lie-flat beds in first class. This is a shot. It took a while to find this one. This is the original lie-flat first class seat. Of course, now they're commonplace in business class. And there was lots of innovations with lounges and catering product, but poor old Concorde seemed to be left behind. And that's a great shame because Concorde was unique. Because the aircraft was so hot during flight, the length would grow by 2 inches. There was a place at the bulkhead which had 1/2 inch gap when you were on the ground, but mid-flight that had grown to 2.5 inches. You flew slightly higher than other aircraft, so you could see the curvature of the earth, as you can see in this image here. And I'll never forget the time that I flew. The pilot gloated, ladies and gentlemen, I do have some bad news. I'm afraid we have some rough weather leaving JFK today, but that doesn't concern us, ladies and gentlemen, because we fly above the weather. So there was a magic, almost exclusive club-like quality to Concorde. Just a few thoughts about how we managed design at British Airways at that time, we wouldn't design internally. We would have a small team of design literate professionals who would manage outside agencies. And these agencies became extensions of us. Predominantly, we would brief agencies to resolve concept and come up with a viable, a believable scheme that we would then circulate across the business. And then we would manage that design all the way through to production. For Concorde, we chose the late Sir Terence Comran, who some of you may know. Arguably, he's the godfather of British design. He was the person who introduced style to the masses, and he did this through his own design consultancy, his own architecture practice, his own retail empire, and his own restaurant chain as well. And he was arguably extremely successful in all aspects of his endeavors. And here's a shot of him earlier in his career when he started Habitat, which grew to be a household name. Pre-IKEA, Habitat was the first retailer to offer European, actually globally inspired modernist design that was affordable. Sir Terence Comran made a really interesting remark to the business in that Concorde was the oldest plane in the fleet, way, way, way older than the Airbuses or even the Boeing 777s or the 747s. It was 20 years older than Boeing and Airbus. So it was the oldest plane in the fleet. So it would be right to ground all of our design explorations in a sense of classic design because of the age of the aircraft. And the other remark he made was, because Concorde is such a beautifully engineered product, it is the result of the pinnacle of science. The reason why that aircraft has such a dramatic form language is driven by its functionality. We should look to classic design that is built around pure functionality and establishing a beauty from that functionality. And he showed us the work of Charles and Ray Eames, the pioneering American furniture designers and architects. And he said, this is where we're to find our inspiration. And this image was key in our thinking. And the idea of leaning on the integrity of functionality, the purity of functionality, the way that there's no form here, or there's no gesture that doesn't find its way on board. It has to be a product of its own integrity. Those ideas seem to dovetail really well with the marketing promise that Concorde is the ultimate business tool. And just before we go into the design, something which I'm very passionate about, and some of these principles have stayed with me throughout my whole life. It's impossible to design anything without truly understanding who you're designing for, what they may want from the experience, and how you can convert them to want to come back and experience your product again. So it was important to really put ourselves in the shoes of the people and the worlds that they live in who will be using Concorde. There were 4 different types of customer, and we would play games. We would pretend to be them. In the marketing world, we call this scenario and persona development, but there were 4 key types of customers. The first were the belongers. No big surprises here. Corporate CEOs, chairmen, mostly men back in those days, predominantly 85% men, finance, insurance. We called these people the belongers, kings in their own kingdom, alpha men. They fly Concorde because it's almost expected of them. These extraordinary individuals are responsible for billions of dollars all across the world. The city slickers were the second group of customers. They're tracking to be the belongers, but they're not quite there yet. These are geniuses in the financial world, insurance, banking, corporate finance, merchant banking. These people were younger, They would fly because they're buying time, not buying luxury. And as I said earlier, they would very often fly supersonic in one direction and subsonic on return. The third group were the self-explorers, as we called them, art, media, fashion folk, the glamorous jet set. Joan Collins was a frequent flyer of Concorde. You may remember her. She was a model and British actress. I think she turned up in Dynasty. Alexis Carrington was her part, if memory serves me correct. She would insist on sitting in seat 1A. And I remember the crew would be delighted to welcome her on board. She was a very big fan of Concorde. In fact, she was invited to fly in the very last Concorde flight, along with Mayor Giuliano at the time, who we now know as Rudy Giuliano, I believe. And the fourth group were the once-in-a-lifetime passengers. So these are more grounded people like perhaps you and I. It could be mum or dad, and they've saved up their whole life for this magical experience, and they want to experience everything it's got to offer. And these four very different groups would coexist together in this remarkably unique experience, traveling at twice the speed of sound, higher than anybody else in the world, sipping on champagne in this extraordinary aircraft. I took this image from the original theme board. It took me a while to dig it out of the shed out the back here. But this simple image, this juxtaposition, really showed us how Concorde is different. Where else can you eat caviar and fly at twice the speed of sound in a piece of equipment that was developed 30 years before you were using it? It was quite an extraordinary mindset to be in as a designer. And this is a key sentiment from the overall positioning. We needed to create a place of serenity, a haven, a sanctuary away from the hustle and bustle of everyday travel. We then collectively developed a series of design principles, design values, if you like. Perhaps you can even call this a design language. Whatever you call it, it's a concerted direction to unite everything that we do in the cabin, whether it's a carpet design, whether it's a uniform amendment, whether it's a crockery or cutlery solution, and whether it's even a scent or a menu option. Everything that we had to do should be filtered by some or all of these crucial values: unique, classic, iconic, seamless, understated, precise, and timeless. We then developed a color palette that was grounded in the corporate blues. This is still a British Airways product, but because it flies faster, we can start to lighten some of those blues, ground it in the engineering reality of the aircraft itself, and then start to bring in some of the freshness to reflect the extraordinary colors that you see and experience when you travel in the inner atmosphere, actually, and then grounding that in comfort, bringing in the browns there. But this was the overall color palette that just seemed to feel right for the brand. And the overall sentiment from a design perspective was, let's now start to bring some of the elegance of the outside into the inside, because there was a mismatch. The beauty of the outside was not portrayed or conveyed or integrated to what was going on inside. But we still needed more direction, and there were two key, very, very simple design elements. The first was to take this delta wing, this form that was created by science, helping the aircraft slice through the atmosphere at twice the speed of sound, an incredibly beautiful, well-proportioned and very elegant shape, this delta shape. And we also liked the idea of precision and target and speed, hence the target there. So we loved the idea of concentric circles and form language. And that's how the design started to evolve. So wherever possible, we started to try and incorporate that wonderful, wonderful delta wing of the outside of the aircraft and start to apply that to the inside of the aircraft. And this is a true story. By complete accident, we noticed that the sidearm here, which was a polished cast aluminum component, to my knowledge, the only one of its kind. And this seat has been described by many critics as probably the most beautiful aircraft seat that's ever flown. It was a carbon fiber bucket seat. The heaviest component on the whole seat was the leather, actually, because Concorde was so fast, weight restriction was a major issue. We noticed during the design phase that the company logo started to emerge. So we developed it, and it became a symbol or a reflection of the British Airways logo. And then, of course, we started to apply that incredible design language to the cutlery itself. And this is the only promotional shot I could find. Unfortunately, not many photographs were taken, which was a great shame, from the promotional aspects of the Concorde interior. It wasn't needed. Concorde didn't need marketing so much, you know, so subsequently we never had the assets. But here you can see the form language there starting to unify again on the teaspoon there, and here you can see the concentric circles. So it was just the delta shape, and those circles were enough to unify the crockery and the glassware together, because typically these will be manufactured by different suppliers, sometimes in different countries. So from an operational standpoint, it's great to have a simplified, understandable design language that everybody can understand quickly. Napkin holders here, and you can see British Airways, they're starting to find its confidence by starting to use the company logo in more interesting ways. And here's a rear shot of the new seats in situ as well. And of course, the program extended to all the soft furnishings. Yeah, I just popped these images literally 5 minutes before we started today. This is me here on the left, sitting very proudly in the British Airways HQ, next to my dear friend and co-worker Neil Stone. And that was the first time we received the prototype seats. And this was myself and the creative director, Adam White from Factory Design, who designed those beautiful seats. And that was during our test flight. And this is my collection. We're going to pass over to Nathan right now, and he's actually got the real collection. My collection are the prototypes. So these were the first or the second series of cutlery, crockery, the napkin rack there, the swing tag. We couldn't even afford to have two aluminium components there. So one was aluminium and one was card. And those, Nathan, just for your information, those were the intended salt and pepper shakers. But I can't remember why, but they never found it through to production. Probably a cost issue, unfortunately. But those were what we intended back in the day. And with that, and beautiful segue to Nathan, who will take us through the actual product.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. By the way, I'm one of those once in a lifetime flyers. I think a few of you on this Zoom are as well. I've always been a plane and space buff. And I did get to fly on the Concorde on July 1st of 2003, which was its last summer of flight. I think its BA stopped in October of that year, and Air France stopped a little bit earlier. So most of these photos are from my own collection. I don't collect a lot of things, but this is sort of my main obsession. And Colors Magazine included my collection in their 79th issue called Collectors back in 2010. So some of these photos, like this one right here, come from that the photo shoot with the a good photographer of that collection. You go to the next slide, please. Here's another shot of some of the base pieces of the ceramic pieces, which were done by Royal Doulton, and the glasses that were done by Nachman. Go to the next slide, please, Paul. So this would be a complete collection or a complete place setting. didn't mean that you would see every one of these dishes on any given meal that you had on the Concorde, but this is the complete set. You had the large plate, the large bowl, and the small bowl. You had the two smaller plates off to the side. You had these really interesting highlighting plates, the speed form, the really compressed speed form oval, the small one, as well as the larger one. And then, of course, you have a sort of hors d'oeuvre tray right up at the top, and then that's a little butter pat. I know there was some conversation over Facebook of what that might be. And so this would be a complete collection. I actually have, or setting, I have about 13 of these. I wanted 12, and then I figured I better plan for some breakage at some point. And so that comes down to not only the 11 porcelain dishes by Royal Doulton, and including the small trays and the butter pats, but as well as the 3 pieces of stemware and the 4 pieces of cutlery, the napkin ring, and then of course the placemats and napkins. I was able to track those down as well, and then the salt and pepper shakers there, because everyone got their own one on their tray. If you go to the next slide, here's another picture of it. So this would have been the sort of big presentation, or at least in some ways the canvas on which the food was presented. If you go to the next slide again, here's a little bit of a close up. You can see the concentric rings there on the saucer, and you can see them on the edges of the plates and the bowls. One of the things that I really like about this design is it's very understated. It's very subtle. All these little details are about quality. They reflect the design themes and language that Paul just outlined. And you'll see a little bit further the close-ups of the glasses and then the cutlery also pick up those speed forms. But here you can see it on the napkin ring again. If you go to the next slide, please. This was one of the other shots from Colors Magazine. Go to the next slide. So here's some details about the saucers, and particularly those 2 oval dishes, which were mostly used for desserts and hors d'oeuvres, I believe. But were those moments to pick up the design language of the uniqueness of the Concorde, picking up that speed form. Next slide, please. Here's the cutlery. You can see again, I think the knife in particular is just, the knife and then the champagne flute here just say Concorde in form so well. Paul talked about the beauty of Concorde came out of its materials and out of the science and engineering required to make it fly. And these 2 pieces in particular, I think, pick that up and bring them into the passenger experience with an otherwise everyday object that you use to eat. But it with such elegance and reverence to what makes the Concorde fly. If you go to the next slide, here's a typical experience. You can see it actually is a very cramped airplane. Those are very small seats. They're not like what we're used to in business class or first class these days. But there's at the front of both cabins, there were 2 cabins, one in front, one in back. They were identical. There wasn't special seating necessarily between the cabins, but at the front of the cabins had this Mach speed meter and altimeter, and sometimes it went a little bit over Mach 2.0. Sometimes it would hit 03 or 04. But it was such a prominent part of the trip, because it was only about a just under 3-hour trip, 2 hours and 50 minutes basically. But this is sort of how you would have experienced the dinnerware. Next slide. This was actually my lunch on the Concorde on July 1st of 2003. I didn't have the presence of mind to take a before photo, so apologies for that. And you can see, Paul, they finally did by that point get those original salt and pepper grinders in.
Yeah.
And you can see, because this is still post 9/11, you can see the plastic cutlery, that because they weren't allowing the original cutlery, the stainless steel, to be used on the plane at that time. You go on. there's also I have a collection. Part of my collection is the servingware, the barware. Some of these come from older British Airways fits, and some of them are gift items. But I particularly like this little creamer because it's just so simple and elegant, and no ornamentation. But the design I feel is unique and authentic. If you go to the next slide again, here's some other elements. These are just drink servers. This comes from, I think, 2 fits before the final fit where Paul was involved in designing. Actually, I take that back. The coaster is from the final fit, I think, and then the 2 drink servers are from, probably 30 years before, actually. Next slide. These are 2 mother of pearl caviar spoons. I did not get to have caviar on my lunch, unfortunately, but these 2 were, again, such simple expressions of quality, a little bit of luxury in there too, but simplicity and elegance at the same time. Next slide. This is some of this, again, servingware. Not all of this necessarily would have been on every flight. I do believe they used the ice buckets and the tray, though. So they had a little bit of a mix and match when it came to the servingware across the generations of place settings and cutlery and things like that. Next slide. Some of the other bar items, etc. You can see there's 2 different generations of drink stirrers there. They had some very interesting champagne poppers and wine openers, etc. Things like that. Next slide. This is sort of my entire collection. I actually had custom made rolling files in the proportions of airplane aisle carts to house not just my files, but then converted 2 of them over to the dinnerware and all my collection of the Concorde stuff. Next slide. Another shot of some of the gift items. Some of the gift items were actually very unique to Concorde, like a watch, a clock with 2 faces, because you might want to keep track of your both time zones in the UK and New York, or in Paris and New York. Next slide. And then I'm a big fan of dinner parties and especially travel stories. So I used my Concorde collection as a prompt to have a dinner party all around travel stories. Next slide. And use that as a theme all the way down to the invitations and the place settings, etc. Next slide. This is my last slide. This actually isn't from British Airways. I have a couple pieces from American, or from Air France, and the top one here is a letter opener, which just you can immediately identify as Concorde, both in shape and elegance and material. And then the bottom one is one of my favorite pieces because it's so simple and utilitarian. It's just a can opener, just like you can still go buy a can opener for probably $1.99 at the store, a simple one, but they made 2 modifications. They flared the base and then they gave it a little bend. And that just transforms a normal can opener into this expression of Concorde. I thought it was just so simple and brilliant, and such a great example of ingenuity, etc. So I'll put into chat the page where all the rest of my Concorde collection is. You can see more photos, but why don't we open up for discussions then and questions? If you go one more, yeah, there you go. That's fine.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed that. I think you have to show, Nathan, you have to show your tie. You may have to wear it.
My little Concorde tie and my little
You could
Halloween.
fall in your dinnerware, or you could get
Yeah.
something on it, unfortunately.
It's my easy Halloween costume. I figure I'd put it on because it's getting close to Halloween anyway.
So I have a question. How scarce are these kind of wonderful dinnerware objects from the Concorde, especially the can opener, which I really want one of?
Well, so I bought everything off eBay. There was a very famous auction. BA auctioned everything from, all their pieces, including parts of the plane, at a very famous auction through Sotheby's. I think it was somewhere in around 2005 or 2007. And of course, I had never heard of the auction at the time, but lots of people who bought big lots of those things then broke them up and started selling on eBay. So I bought everything on eBay over a series of years as they came available, with the exception one piece, the little butter pats, those little round things, I could not find anywhere. As far as I'm concerned, they may not have made it to auction at all. And then BA has a wonderful museum at Heathrow. It's now moved into the new Terminal 5, but it used to be off, around the backside of the airport. And so I wrote to the museum once, and ended up visiting. And while I was there, I pointed at them and basically said, "Hey, you wouldn't by chance have 13 of those in storage, would you?" And they got back to me, and sure enough, they found 13, and they sent them to me, and that sort of completed all the place settings. So it was very sweet of them to do. But you can buy stuff on eBay today. I just bought one of these ties as we started because I thought I should probably have a spare. And every now and then those can openers do show up.
Okay. So when you have your parties, not to monopolize all the questions here, but when you have the parties, do you replicate the menus that you must have collected from the Concorde? Do you try to replicate some era of dining?
That is a great question. And I was going to, and then, the menu is pretty brief. And the portions are small, obviously, because you're on a plane and etc. I decided the menu wasn't elaborate enough to do a really good long dinner party. So no, I made my own menu, and I have that published somewhere on my website as well.
Okay, great.
So we have a number of questions and comments that have come in on the chat. You did mention earlier that there were some of the people participating also flew on the Concorde, and I don't know if you noticed, but one person was actually on the same flight that you were.
That was me.
Yes, Sandy, how do you know we were on the same flight?
Because you said you were on the last one. Well, no, we weren't. I take that back. Because I flew out of Paris on the last one.
Right, exactly. I was July, so I wasn't I meant I was on the last summer, the last year that they flew. I was not on the. Tell us about the last flight from Air France.
Well, I'm an interpreter. Well, I was an interpreter, and I was based in Paris, and my other home was in Ann Arbor, Michigan, which is where I am now. And I had always wanted to fly on the Concorde numerous times. And then I heard that they were stopping, and it was like, okay, I've got to go. And so I ate pasta for months so that I could afford it because it was very expensive. And we flew over it. It was just amazing. And I remember the moment when we got past Batu, it was just amazing. We landed in Kennedy, and I was flying on with a flight out of LaGuardia. So I took the bus. I was still grinning when I got to LaGuardia. And the person who was checking me in looked at me. I said, "Don't mind me." And I told them I just got off the Concorde. And she called everybody in. She was just on the Concorde. So it was amazing. It was a trip of a lifetime. I also took the SS France steamship across one time, and it turned out that turned out being its last sailing because people went on strike afterwards. So I have seen off both the Concorde and the France.
The important question, Sandy, is what did you steal from the Concorde when you left? Did you walk away with anything?
That's what I just asked.
No. What did I steal? No, I didn't. Well, that's not true, but they gave it to us. The pen.
Excellent.
But they gave it to us. And it was just amazing. And I remember, as one of the two of you said, I believe it was Paul, looking out the window and seeing the curvature of the earth. That was just amazing. That was just, I mean, and I had a window seat. I just couldn't take my eyes off of it. It was, and I've never
Thank
seen such a narrow aisle in my life.
Yeah. Fran, to your question, I didn't have the nerve to take anything from Concorde. I mean, thanks to Paul and everyone there, there's such an air of sort of official, almost royal reverence for this thing that I didn't have the nerve to take anything. But I do have a little collection of salt and pepper shakers from other airlines, because they just happen to, in turbulence fall off the tray and end up in your bag.
I guess that was a question that I had, was when you buy these things on email or eBay, is it because they were stolen off the Concorde by passengers, or somehow made available to the public after the last flight?
That's a good question. I think there were always a set of gift items, right? So the things like the binoculars and the pens and etc., you could buy those. So it is possible that people got those legitimately. And then, of course, after this auction from Sotheby's, there was a flood of materials and objects made available that were never available before. I imagine most of the servingware either came from there, or maybe some sticky flight attendants during their time. And then things like the coasters and the drink stirrers, I'm sure, those were essentially legitimate. But the bigger items either got there legitimately from the auction or over time from flight personnel, I think, more than anything else. You certainly couldn't build a collection around like trying to piece together an entire, or more than one entire setting, unless you were getting it from these larger sources.
So another question is, was there a dress code to travel on the Concorde?
I don't believe there was a dress code for passengers. Certainly not during my time in the mid-90s. When I flew officially, if memory serves me correct, there was a boxer, an Indian boxer who was the guy of the moment. I forget his name, and yeah, he was dressed very casually. So I don't recall there was a dress code as such.
On Air France, there
was there. Yeah, but you could see the different types of customer. You could see that what there was a code actually is where you would sit. So if you were more important, you would sit towards the front of the aircraft, and the once in a lifetime passengers, typically they would be seated halfway down or towards the rear of the aircraft. But
I must have smiled, right?
There was a dress code for staff. So staff flying Concorde had to wear, guys had to wear trousers. And we had to wear a dress shirt as well, but I don't believe a tie nor a blazer, but we couldn't wear jeans. Jeans were banned. But that was for Concorde and business class and first class as well.
Oh, with the plastic cutlery, was that a unique design for the Concorde as well, or was that just something off the shelf?
I don't believe, Nathan's probably the better person to answer that. I don't believe it was a unique design. Post 9/11, British Airways was in survival mode. It literally was survival mode, and that was a number of things happened during that very unusual period. So the design department was less about creating the passenger experience, and it was more about how can design reduce cost, which was a completely different criteria to work from. But I'm sure whoever at the time would have struggled to get the best quality plastic possible. But it was probably down to a cost-based issue at the end.
Yeah, I agree. If you put that slide back up, I would be very surprised if it was custom made. It would have had a little bit more I don't know, distinction to it. But if you do look at it, I think that they were very deliberate about which cutlery they chose. That one's a little blown out, or if you zoom in a little bit, because it had these white sort of ridges down the length of them, which kind of went with the, in this case, they weren't concentric circles, but those sort of parallel lines did fit the motif fairly well. So I think they were just smart about where they got their supplies.
Yeah.
So I think someone had their hand raised. Bill, do you want to ask your question? The man who has his hand raised?
Okay, it's me.
Yes.
Yeah. Hi. My wife and I are Brenda and Ken Fritz. We're in Los Angeles. It was an amazing time. We were in Paris, coming back to the United States. And I saw we're talking about dress code, a woman wearing clearly a house dress, but she had two aides with her. She sat directly across the aisle from me. I had no idea who she was, but they seemed to be ministering to her. And as we took off, we had chatted a little, and I asked her where she was going, and she told me that she was going to see her son, who was in business school at Stanford University, and she was very happy about that. And then the Mach meter started getting fishy. It was 201, then 189, 187, 201, 22, back and forth, and you felt the plane a little bit jerky. Now we feel the plane is turning around. It is definitely turning around. And they said, ladies and gentlemen, we have a mechanical problem and we're going to turn back. At which time the lady across the aisle freaks out and starts screaming, we're going to die. I know we're going to die. I know we're going to die. And I reached across the aisle and I took her hand and I said, we're not going to die. And she said, how do you know? And I said, look how nicely this flight attendants are picking up the dishes. And we got back into Paris, and we were now sitting there, and they said, there's a plane coming in from DC, another Concorde, we'll put you on that and you can go back to New York. Okay. So then a little while later, they said, no, that plane had a mechanical also. So we're going to put you up in hotels. We have a hotel right in the airport at De Gaulle, and we'll put you all in that hotel. Well, the people that I was traveling with said, listen, we stayed at the George Cinq last night. I'm not staying at some Marriott down at which I had also been at the George Cinq. So I said, we're not going to go there. So the guy from the airline said, okay, just be quiet. I'll give you whatever you want. Just be quiet. So all the other people got bused to this hotel, and we stayed overnight. I get back on the plane, and the French lady is sitting directly across the aisle from me. And now she's calmer. And she said, I don't usually sit here. I usually sit with the pilot. And I thought, she's crazy. So she got up and she didn't come back. So I said to the flight attendant, you should check the bathroom to see if this woman is okay, because she's been gone a long time. And she said, oh, no, she's fine. She's sitting with the pilot. And I said, what? She said, well, don't you know who she is? And I said, absolutely not. She said, that's Mrs. Rothschild. She always flies with the pilot.
Wonderful story. Thank you for
Story.
It
So
was
are
a
there other
remarkable,
questions, Bill?
it was a great one. Yeah. Thank you.
Very much. That was great.
Okay, for Paul, there's a question. With respect to the redesign, was there ever thought of adding a simple red or blue British Airway blue accent to the edge of the plates and platters following the curvature of the piece?
Yeah, that's a great question. We were always very cautious of applying the corporate red in the context of an interior. When it was, I'm trying to think of an occasion where we did actually use it. So the only time I think you would probably see it was on the speed mark, which was the company logo. The corporate red didn't lend itself towards an experience. It wasn't a useful color from an interior perspective. And a lot of what we tried to do was to try to give the illusion of a more natural environment. So wherever possible, try to introduce the feeling of wood, because of course you can't have wood in the cabin because of the fire hazard. There was an internal conflict, if you like, over it never flew in the end because of the cost reduction, but we did redesign the lavatories on board, and these are tiny spaces, and there was disagreement between the design team as to whether the box underneath the seat pan of the toilet should be an aqua green or a burgundy red. And that was a 6-month arm wrestle, which was hypothetical because of cost. It never happened anyway. But I don't. You know what? We got the burgundy in, I believe, on some soft furnishing. So I think a pillowcase was burgundy, and we went for a darker red because that corporate red, which is Pantone reference 485, I remember it well. That was developed as a graphic element. You know, it was developed for signage, recognition, navigation. They're the red, and of course that stems from the Union Jack, of course, you know, the red, white, and blue, very similar to American Airlines. So apart from the tail, I don't recall the red being anywhere in the interior apart from the logo, but we did try to incorporate the burgundy. And by darkening that red and transforming it into a burgundy, it's an easier color to work within the context of an interior. But today, if you have a look at some of the new cabin seat design for Club Europe, which is the Europe business product, the red is used quite effectively as a secondary color. So it might be an accent that's only revealed if you choose to move your headrest. You've then got a flash of red on the inside. And there's something quite British about that. And it probably comes from British tailoring. And I'm thinking of designers such as Paul Smith and Oswald Boateng. These were tailors that would offer flamboyant colors that are a second read, not a first read. So it might be the lining of a pocket, or it might be, you know, the lining of a sleeve, let's say. But no, I don't recall us having the courage to use the corporate red, which was a great shame in retrospect.
So I think one last question. The kind of the demise of the Concorde, was that because of the accident, or was there some other reason that contributed?
My understanding, it was for economic reasons. And depending on who you asked at British Airways, you would get a different answer. There were some that maintained that Concorde never actually drove a profit. There were others that argued, well, the halo effect of Concorde is so damn important. It raises the whole equity or the value of the brand as the master brand. You know, there were arguably Concorde would outshine British Airways on many occasions. You know, people would have a relationship directly with Concorde, not with British Airways Concorde. Yeah, so that's the best I can recall for what happened at the time there.
Yeah, I would just add that from my understanding, by 2000, pretty much every time the Concorde flew, something needed to be replaced on the plane, and that the real issue was that Aerospatiale, who manufactured the parts, just said no, enough. We're not making parts for this plane anymore. It's a 40-year-old plane, and we're not going to service anymore. It was interesting to note that at the time, so service was suspended after the crash outside of Paris, but then it was brought back, and so it flew for I think about a year or a year and a half, both Air France side and BA side, but then they decided, you know, enough. And my understanding, the rumor is that Richard Branson, who is the founder of Virgin, was in talks with British Airways to buy the remaining fleet of Concordes and use it for nonstop service between Heathrow and Honolulu. But the thing that scrubbed that deal is that, again, Aerospatiale is saying no more with parts. But it looks like, Sandy, you may have some intel on this.
I do. Because that was part of my interpreting had to do with that. And there was a problem caused by the United States, because originally the flights out of Paris, at least, were supposed to go to New York and Washington, New York for business, Washington for politics. and also to Dallas or Fort Worth, I don't know, somewhere in there for oil, and to Hollywood, to Los Angeles for Hollywood. But America refused to let them fly over American territory at supersonic speeds. So it made it not useful. So they only ever flew to Washington and New York. And that meant that part of their clientele was not, was not interested.
They actually did fly to, I believe it was Houston via Braniff, but just not at supersonic speed. So there was an interesting insurance problem where they would land at either JFK or Washington, D.C. The plane would be sold to Braniff for $1. It would fly under Braniff to Houston and back, or maybe it was Dallas and back, but I think it was Houston and back. And then it got sold back to either BA or Air France. I'm not sure who was doing this at the time, in order to be covered under insurance. So, but I don't think it ran for very long.
No, but these were supposed to be nonstop flights. And they wanted it to be at supersonic speeds to make it of interest. And America said, no, you cannot overfly the United States at supersonic speeds. So they dropped those two.
Right, but the charter flights the charter flights of Concorde did go elsewhere in the world, especially in the beginning when they were making their sort of preview flights and trying to sell the flights. Because I have a friend that was flying a private plane, landing in Honolulu once, and looked in sort of the mirrors, the rearview mirrors, and here was Concorde back behind him, trying to land right behind him. So it did get around.
They flew to Brazil from Paris.
Sure.
Also, the load factors were never that healthy. I seem to recall on average, Heathrow to JFK was about 60% capacity, and JFK's back to Heathrow was sometimes 20% capacity.
Yeah.
So,
well, and it was also small. It only had 100 and how many passengers? So,
And I guess the need for time became less relevant as technology developed and teleworking and etc. IT, the digital revolution. It deemed the gift of speed more redundant with Concorde. I mean, that's a guess, but
yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
So I think maybe we're going to wrap it up tonight. We want to thank you, Paul and Nathan, and all the participants, and for your wonderful stories. So I think we've gathered quite a few news stories tonight. And be sure, if you can look at the chat, you'll see all kinds of information in there, except the thing that Nathan sent me about where I can maybe get a can opener. Don't look at that one. Anyway, thank you all for participating.
Thank you.
Have a good rest of the day or wherever you are. Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Thank you for hosting us and for managing such a beautiful museum, by the way.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Good night.